The wind screamed across the frozen plains, ripping through the darkness like a beast unleashed. Snow whirled in violent circles, devouring the last traces of daylight. Somewhere beneath that white fury stood a small cabin, its roof half buried, its chimney barely breathing smoke against the storm. Inside, a fire flickered low, fighting to stay alive against the cold that seemed determined to swallow everything. Eli Mercer pressed his shoulder against the cabin door as it rattled on its hinges. The rope around his waist was slick with frost, the lantern in his hand guttering weakly. Every gust of wind felt like a slap of knives. He had seen plenty of winters in the Wyoming Territory, but none as cruel as this one. His fingers, cracked and bloodied, struggled with the latch of the barn gate. The horses inside neighed in panic, sensing the storm's wrath. He whispered, "Easy now," though his own voice trembled. The snow bit at his face until his beard was rimmed with ice. He slammed the gate shut, his breath coming in ragged bursts. Somewhere in the darkness, a timber snapped like a gunshot. He turned, scanning the white void. The storm was alive. It moved, it howled, hunted through the roar of the wind. He thought he heard something else, a cry. At first faint, then clearer. It wasn't an animal. It was human. Eli froze, heart pounding, trying to catch it again through the thunder of the storm. There it was, a woman's voice, carried by the wind, weak and broken. He knew it was madness to go out there. He could barely find his way back to the cabin as it was. But a man couldn't ignore a cry for help. Not out here, where mercy was the only thing that kept his soul from turning to stone. He tied the rope tighter around his waist, hooked the other into the post, and stepped into the storm. Each step sank knee-deep in the snow. The world was nothing but white, sky, ground, breath, all one. His lantern was a dying star, swallowed by the dark. His teeth chattered, and his boots filled with snow. Still, he pressed on, calling out between gusts. "Hello, can you hear me?" The cry came again, closer this time. He stumbled forward until his boots struck something solid. Dropping to his knees, he brushed away the snow. A pale hand, a face still as marble, framed by frozen strands of hair. She was dressed in white, lace and silk stiff with ice, a bridal veil frozen across her cheek. Eli's breath caught. A bride, out here in the middle of nowhere. Her lips were blue, her eyes closed. He pressed his fingers to her neck, faint pulse. Barely there. He didn't think, he just acted. He lifted her into his arms, the fabric of her gown cracking like brittle parchment in the cold. The wind screamed harder, as if the storm didn't want to let her go. Back at the cabin, Eli burst through the door, kicking it shut with his heel. His son, Ben, looked up from the hearth, his small hands clutching a tin cup of broth. The boy's eyes widened. "Pa, who's that?" Eli lowered the woman to the floor near the fire. "She's near frozen. Get the blanket, son, quick." Ben scrambled to obey. Eli stripped off the woman's soaked gloves and boots, rubbing her hands between his own, trying to coax warmth back into her skin. Steam rose from her dress as the fire touched it, the scent of frost and fabric filling the room. For long minutes, she didn't move. Eli pressed his ear to her chest, still faint, but there. He fed the fire, added wood, leaned close. "Come on, ma'am. You fight now. You fight." Then, just barely, she gasped. A sharp, wet breath. Her body jerked. Eli flinched back, relief and shock flooding through him. Her eyes fluttered open, wild and unfocused. "You're safe," he said quietly. "You're all right." Her gaze darted around the cabin, then down at her torn gown. She tried to speak, but only a rasp came out. Eli handed her a cup of water, steadying her trembling hands. "Drink slow," he said. Ben crouched near her, wide-eyed. "Pa, she's dressed like for a wedding." Eli didn't answer. He studied the woman's face. She was young, maybe 20, but her eyes held something older than fear. Pain. She looked around as though expecting someone to burst through the door after her. "Where?" she began, voice breaking. "Where am I?" "Wyoming Territory," Eli replied. "You're lucky I found you when I did. Storm like this don't forgive much." She stared at the flames, shivering beneath the blanket. Her lips trembled, but not just from cold. I shouldn't be here, she whispered. Eli frowned. Ma'am, that's between you and the Lord. For now, you just need to live through the night. Her eyes flickered toward him, full of dread. He'll come looking for me. Eli paused, the weight of those words settling heavy in the air. The wind battered the windows, the world outside roaring like a wounded beast. Inside, the three of them, man, boy, and stranger, sat in the flickering half-light, shadows dancing across the log walls. Ben leaned closer to the fire, clutching the blanket tighter around her shoulders. What's your name, miss? She hesitated, as though afraid the name itself could summon something from the storm. Finally, she whispered, Clara. Eli nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. All right, Clara. You rest now. She lay back, eyes half closing, her fingers still gripping the edge of the blanket, like it was the only thing anchoring her to this world. Eli sat by the fire long after she slept, staring into the flames, listening to the wind tear at the cabin walls. A runaway bride, half dead in the snow. He didn't know where she came from or what hell she was fleeing, but he knew one thing for certain. No man leaves a woman to die in a blizzard. And whoever had done it, he'd come looking. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, a fragile spark of life had been rekindled. And with it, a storm of a different kind began to stir in Eli Mercer's heart. Morning came gray and silent, the kind of dawn that carried no warmth. The storm had eased, leaving behind a white world that seemed carved from glass. Smoke rose thinly from the cabin chimney, curling into the pale sky. Inside, the fire had burned low but steady. Clara lay near it, wrapped in wool and silence. Eli sat at the table, mending a strap, his hands rough and scarred. He watched her out of the corner of his eye. She hadn't said much since the night he found her, only a few words between long silences. The boy, Ben, moved about quietly, stirring the pot and feeding kindling to the coals. When she stirred, Eli turned his gaze back to his work, pretending not to notice. She sat up slowly, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. Her wedding dress, creased, torn, and stained, hung awkwardly around her. He spoke first, his voice steady but kind. You ought to keep that blanket on. You're still white as frost. Clara nodded, drawing it back over herself. I thank you for saving me. Eli shrugged, slightly. Any man would have done the same. She looked up at him, eyes hollow but searching. Not every man. For a moment, the only sound was the crackle of firewood. Ben brought her a cup of broth, smiling shyly. She accepted it with trembling hands. Thank you, young man, she said softly. My name's Ben, he said proudly. What's yours? Clara, she replied. Clara Dawson. Ben nodded, satisfied, and went back to poking at the fire. Eli's brow furrowed slightly. The name didn't ring any bells, but something about her, her fear, her constant glances toward the window, told him she was running from more than just the cold. By midday, she had found her strength enough to stand. She insisted on helping with the chores, sweeping the floor, fetching water from the barrel, but she moved like someone who'd lived too long with bruises unseen. Her wrists bore faint marks, the kind a wedding ring doesn't make. Eli noticed, but said nothing. Some wounds healed faster when left in peace. Days passed. The snow outside thickened in drifts, cutting them off from the road. Clara recovered slowly, her color returning, her eyes softening when she watched Ben. She read to him from an old Bible, her voice calm and low, as if she were speaking to herself as much as to him. One evening, when the light faded and the wind began to whisper again through the cracks, Eli sat sharpening his knife. Clara sat nearby, sewing a tear in Ben's coat. The boy had already fallen asleep by the fire. You said someone might come looking for you, Eli said quietly, his eyes on the blade. You want to tell me who? Clara hesitated, her hands stilling on the fabric. Her throat moved before words came. I was to be married. Yesterday. Eli glanced at her. In that storm? She nodded, eyes lowering. He didn't care about the weather. He cared about the land. Eli leaned back in his chair. Your husband? Her voice dropped to a whisper. Not by my choice. He paid my uncle for me. Called it a dowry. I called it a sale. The words hung in the air like frost. Eli said nothing for a while. He stared into the fire, the knife forgotten in his hand. Finally, he muttered, "You ran." "I ran," she echoed. "I left the church before he could touch me. His men chased me into the storm. I thought—" She looked toward the window, her breath trembling. "I thought I'd rather freeze than go back." Eli's jaw tightened. He'd seen men like that before, ranch barons who thought everything had a price. He thought of his own wife, long gone, buried under the cottonwoods behind the cabin. She'd been gentle, strong, the only light he'd ever known. He'd sworn never to let another soul suffer like that, if he could help it. "You're safe here," he said finally. "Nobody's going to find you for now." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure. Out here, word traveled on the wind, and men with money always found a way to track what they thought they owned. 3 days later, near dusk, a rider appeared. Eli saw him first through the window, a dark figure moving slow through the snow, horse steaming in the cold. The man's hat was pulled low, his coat thick with frost. He didn't come to the door right away, just lingered by the fence, scanning the cabin like a wolf sniffing for weakness. Clara went still when Eli reached for his rifle. "Who is it?" she whispered. "Stay inside," he said firmly. He stepped out into the cold, the rifle resting against his shoulder. "Evening," Eli called. The stranger nodded, his breath fogging. "You seen anyone pass through here?" "A woman. Young. Might have been wearing white." Eli's heart slowed, steady and cold. "Ain't seen a soul in days," he said flatly. "Storm near buried us." The man studied him, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "You sure? My boss is missing his bride. Run off on her wedding night." "Can't help you," Eli replied. "You best turn back before nightfall. Road's near gone under." The man spat into the snow, his jaw tightening. "If you do see her, tell her we'll find her. One way or another." Eli's hand tightened on the rifle. He didn't speak until the rider finally turned and disappeared into the dusk. When he came back inside, Clara was standing by the wall, pale as the snow outside. "He was one of them," she said quietly. "I know," Eli said. "He's gone for now, but they'll be back." Clara's eyes brimmed with tears she refused to shed. "You shouldn't have lied for me. You got a boy to protect." Eli's voice was calm, but his gaze was firm. "Then I reckon I just did." Silence filled the room, deep and heavy. Ben slept soundly by the fire, unaware of the danger his father had invited under their roof. Clara sank into the chair, trembling, her hands gripping the blanket. She looked at Eli, her voice soft as a confession. "You risked everything for me." "What?" He met her eyes. "'Cause once someone did the same for me, and I never got the chance to thank her." Outside, the wind moaned across the frozen plains once more. Inside, the fire crackled, casting their shadows against the cabin wall. 3 souls bound not by blood, but by the fragile trust born from shared fear. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the men who hunted Clara were already turning their horses north, following tracks half buried in the snow. The storm broke at last, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt almost sacred. The plains stretched wide and white beneath a pale sun, the world reborn under a sheet of ice. For the first time in days, the cabin door swung open without the wind trying to tear it from its hinges. Eli stood on the porch, rifle slung over his shoulder, studying the horizon. Nothing moved out there. No riders, no smoke, only the endless gleam of winter. Inside, Clara packed bread and smoked meat into a small bundle. Her hands were steadier now. Her color returned, though shadows still lingered behind her eyes. Ben darted between them, full of restless energy, his laughter echoing softly through the cabin. It was a sound Eli hadn't heard since his wife's passing, a sound that made the emptiness inside him stir. But the peace was fragile. The rider's visit days ago had changed everything. Eli knew they wouldn't stop looking. Men like that didn't forget an insult. "We can't stay here," he said, turning back inside. "If they find this place, they'll burn it to the ground." Clara froze. "Go? Where would we even?" "North," Eli said. "Into the foothills. There's a hunter's trail. Hard country, but they'll lose our tracks in the drifts. Clara hesitated, her voice low. You'd leave your home? For me. He didn't answer right away. He looked at her, then at Ben, who was wrapping his small scarf around his neck. Home don't mean much if it ain't safe. By afternoon, they were packed. Clara rode one horse with Ben in front of her. Eli led another loaded with supplies. The snow glared white beneath the sun, and the air bit like knives. Every hoofbeat sounded like it might draw the whole world's attention. They traveled in silence, following the frozen creek through narrow canyons. As dusk fell, the world grew quiet again, the kind of quiet that hums with warning. Eli felt it first, eyes on them from somewhere unseen. He stopped, raising his hand. Then he whispered, "Stay close." From the ridge above came a low growl. Then another. Shadows shifted among the trees. Wolves. Eli shouldered his rifle, scanning the ridge. Keep moving. Slow and steady. The wolves followed, their eyes glinting amber in the fading light. One darted down the slope, teeth bared. Eli fired once, the shot echoing across the valley. The wolf fell, snow blooming red beneath it, but the others didn't scatter. They kept coming, hungry and bold. Go! Eli shouted. They rode hard through the deepening snow, the horses snorting clouds of steam. The world became a blur of motion, branches whipping past, the sound of snarls too close behind. Clara clung to Ben, whispering prayers through chattering teeth. Then, from the trees ahead, a figure appeared, tall, wrapped in furs, bow drawn. In one fluid motion, the stranger loosed an arrow. A wolf leapt from behind them, and fell midair, the arrow buried deep in its chest. The man lowered his bow, but didn't approach. His face was half shadowed by his hood, his eyes sharp and calm. Eli slowed his horse, keeping his rifle ready. We don't want trouble. The stranger said nothing. He glanced at the wolves retreating into the trees, then back at Eli. With a nod, he motioned toward a sheltered hollow nearby, a signal, not an invitation. Eli hesitated. Then he nodded back. Come on, he said to Clara. We'll camp there tonight. The hollow offered protection from the wind. The stranger, clearly a native hunter, built a small fire with practiced ease. He moved silently, efficiently, like part of the wilderness itself. Ben watched him with wide eyes as he dressed the fallen wolf, muttering something Eli couldn't understand. When the fire burned steady, Eli spoke. Name's Mercer. My boy's Ben. This here's Clara. The man met his eyes, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he said Coda. His voice was low and deep, touched with the accent of his people. Eli nodded. You saved us back there. Coda gave no reply, only poked the fire with a stick, the sparks dancing upward. Clara, wrapped in a blanket, studied him carefully. There was something in his gaze, strength but also loss. A quiet sorrow she recognized. Later that night, they sat around the fire, the storm clouds gone, but the air still sharp with cold. The flames cast their faces in orange light. Clara broke the silence first. You live out here alone? Coda nodded once. The land gives what it wants, takes what it wants. Eli understood that truth all too well. He added a log to the fire. We're heading north. Folks looking for her. Coda's eyes flicked toward Clara, then to Ben. Many trails cross, he said. Some not safe. Eli glanced toward the boy, already asleep by the flames. Ain't much choice. A long silence followed. The fire crackled softly. Then Clara's voice, small but clear. If you hadn't found me, I'd have died out there. I still don't know why you went after me. Eli stared into the flames. Because you cried for help, he said. That's reason enough. She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening in the firelight. Most men wouldn't have heard. He looked up at her, meeting her gaze across the fire. Maybe I was meant to. For a moment, the world felt still. The fire's warmth touched their faces, their breaths mingling with the smoke. Coda looked between them, but said nothing. He simply watched the sparks drift upward, then stood, melting into the shadows of the trees to keep watch. Sometime near midnight, the wolves came again. Their howls cut through the silence like the echo of ghosts. Coda's voice rang low but firm. Wake! Eli was already reaching for his rifle. Clara held Ben close, shielding him behind her. The wolves circled the hollow, eyes glowing, breath steaming in the dark. Then they came, 5, 6 of them, silent, swift, all teeth and fury. The night exploded with sound. Eli fired once, twice, muzzle flash lighting the snow. Coda moved like lightning, his arrows flying true. A wolf lunged at Clara. She swung a burning branch from the fire, striking it across the snout. It yelped and fled into the dark. When the last of them fell, the night fell silent again. Only the crackle of the fire and the ragged sound of breathing remained. Eli lowered his rifle, chest heaving. Coda stood calm, scanning the trees. Clara sank to her knees, clutching Ben tight. He was crying, but softly, more from fear than pain. Eli crouched beside them, resting a hand on Ben's shoulder. "It's all right, boy. It's over." Clara looked up at him, tears in her eyes. "You saved us again." He shook his head. "No, we saved each other." Coda glanced at the 3 of them, then turned back to the trees, watching the horizon where dawn began to whisper its first light. The wolves were gone, but Eli knew the real danger was still ahead. Men, not beasts. Yet for the first time since the storm began, he felt something shift deep inside him. Not peace, not yet, but the start of it. And as the firelight flickered over their faces, 3 souls and a stranger sat bound by a single truth. Out here in the wild, you survived not by blood, but by trust. The dawn rose pale and cold, the kind that looked more like the dying of night than the birth of day. Frost clung to every branch, every blade of grass. The valley below stretched quiet and untouched, a world suspended between danger and calm. Eli watched the horizon as he packed the horses. He could feel it in his bones. Something was coming. Coda crouched near the embers of the fire, tying his bowstring. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he too could sense the shift in the wind. Clara helped Ben into his coat, her hands trembling slightly though she tried to hide it. They'd survived the wolves, the storm, the cold. But survival, Eli knew, was only ever a pause before the next trial. By midday, they were moving again, winding through narrow ravines where the snow reached their knees. The silence was heavy, broken only by the creak of saddles and the crunch of hoofs. Clara's eyes searched the ridges. "Do you think they're still following?" she asked. Eli didn't look back. Men like that don't give up easy. They'll come until something stops them. Ben looked up at him, worry creasing his small face. "Will we be okay, Pa?" Eli forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We'll be fine, son, long as we keep moving." But they didn't make it far. As they reached the open plain, movement flickered ahead. 3 riders cresting the ridge, black shapes against the blinding snow. Eli's heart dropped. He turned sharply to Coda. "Take Clara and Ben. Get to the trees." Coda's eyes met his for a long moment. Then he nodded once and spurred his horse toward the pine line, Clara clutching Ben tight behind him. Eli stayed behind, rifle in hand, waiting as the riders descended. The wind carried their laughter, cruel, confident. The man at the front wore a heavy coat trimmed with fur, his hat casting a shadow over a face Eli had never seen but recognized all the same. The kind of man who owned everything he saw. The groom. "Well now," the man called as he slowed his horse. "Ain't this a sight? Heard tell there was a rancher up this way tookin' a lady who weren't his." Eli said nothing. He stood his ground, rifle leveled. "She's not yours," he said finally. The man chuckled. "Boy, everything west of the Missouri's mine if I want it. That woman, too." He dismounted, boots sinking into the snow. "She's property, promised to me before God and men." Eli's grip tightened. "Then God made a bad deal." The man's smile faded. "You got no right to keep what's mine." Eli's voice was low and steady. "Out here, nobody belongs to anybody. The land don't take sides, but I do." The tension snapped. A gun flashed from the man's coat. The first shot missed, kicking up snow near Eli's boot. Eli fired back, his bullet catching one rider clean in the shoulder, sending him sprawling. The others scattered for cover, the world erupting in thunder and smoke. Coda appeared from the ridge above, arrows whistling down with deadly precision. One struck the second rider through the leg. Another pinned his coat to a tree. Clara crouched low behind the rocks, shielding Ben, whispering for him to keep his head down. Eli's second shot hit true. The groom staggered back, clutching his side. Blood spread across his coat, dark and thick against the white. Still, he raised his pistol, aiming at the rocks where Clara hid. "No!" Eli shouted, stepping into the open. The shot cracked. Pain tore through his shoulder, but Eli stayed on his feet. He raised his rifle one last time, steady despite the burn, and fired. The groom dropped to his knees, the pistol falling from his hand. For a moment, the world went silent except for the soft hiss of falling snow. The other riders fled, vanishing into the whiteness. Eli staggered forward, breathing hard, until he stood over the man in the snow. The groom's eyes were still open, staring up at the sky. "You'll freeze out here," Eli said quietly. The man coughed, blood staining his lips. "So will you." "Maybe," Eli murmured, "but at least I'll die free." The man's eyes went still. Eli lowered his rifle, chest heaving, the cold burning through him more than the wound. Clara ran to him, her face pale with fear. "Eli," she pressed a hand against his shoulder, trying to stop the bleeding. "You shouldn't have." He caught her wrist gently. "Had to." His voice was weak, but calm. "You can't live your life running forever. Sometimes you've got to turn and face the storm." Coda approached, silent as ever, examining the wound. "Not deep," he said. "You live." Clara looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you for everything." Coda gave a faint nod. "Storm's over," he said simply. "You have new life now." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small carved figure, an eagle, wings spread, and placed it in Eli's hand. "For your son, to remember strength." Before they could speak again, he turned and walked toward the tree-line, vanishing into the snow like a ghost returning to the land. That evening, the three of them made camp beneath a wide sky streaked with dying gold. The air smelled of pine and smoke. Clara cleaned Eli's wound while Ben sat close, holding the small wooden eagle. "Will he come back, Pa?" the boy asked. Eli smiled faintly. "Men like him don't come back, but they never really leave either." When the fire burned low, Clara stared into the flames. "You gave up everything for me. Your home, your peace." Eli looked at her, eyes soft. "Didn't lose much I wasn't already missing." Ben leaned against her, his head on her arm. He whispered drowsily, "Ma." The word hung between them like a prayer. Clara froze, then glanced at Eli. His expression didn't change, but the smallest smile touched his lips. "He's got a good sense for things," he said quietly. Weeks later, spring crept across the land. The cabin was rebuilt on higher ground, wood fresh and warm in the sun. The snow melted into streams, the grass pushing through again. Ben ran barefoot through the field, chasing a chicken, his laughter ringing out clear and bright. Clara hung laundry on a line, her hair loose in the wind. The old wedding ring she once wore was gone, buried somewhere in the thawing earth. Eli stood by the fence, shoulders still stiff but healing, watching them. The world around him felt different, softer somehow. The ghosts of the past still lingered, but they no longer ruled him. Sometimes at dusk, he'd look toward the hills and think of Coda's quiet wisdom, of the storm that had nearly taken everything but instead had brought something new. Clara joined him at the fence, her hand brushing his. They stood together without words, the silence between them full of understanding. The wind moved through the grass, whispering like an old friend. Sometimes the storm brings what we never dared to pray for. And when the sun dipped low, painting the plains in gold, the small cabin glowed with the light of something fragile but real, a new beginning born from the coldest winter. If this story touched your heart, the voice would say softly as the screen faded to black, "Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Frontier Tales." Here, every tale is a fight for hope, a whisper of love, and the spirit of the wild that still lives in us all.